Specialists are the only true support class in XCOM 2. While it could be easy to dismiss them for this, they're very useful for a lot of the objectives in the game, and they have some helpful utility abilities. To compensate for this, specialists use assault rifles as their primary weapons, which are one of the weakest standard weapons in the game. And while they do get some decent offensive abilities, most of them are only really good against purely robotic enemies. This means that while specialists are useful, they're often one of the first classes I consider dropping. Specialists are interesting in that they don't really have a must-have attachment. You can kind of spec them however you want. There are two attachments I consider at the start. A scope, since their accuracy isn't too bad, or a stock, since it'll guarantee at least a third of their damage. Later on, you'll want to consider an expanded magazine if you have any spare. This is for an ability they unlock towards the end game, which we'll discuss in a bit. Finally, a repeater is a good option here, because they deal the least damage, so they'd get the most benefit out of it. For utility items, it depends what kind of specialist you're building. I'd say if you're going for a medic, then obviously a medikit is a good consideration, otherwise I would take a skulljack to boost your hacking stat. Regardless of what type of specialist I'm going for, I usually end up giving them the mimic beacon. Of all the classes in the game, the specialist is often the one whose attacks I need the least, so it makes sense for them to be the one who carries the mimic beacon. Plus they have a bunch of abilities they can use first that don't end their turn. The ability branches for specialist are Battle Medic and Combat Hacker. Medic obviously has a bunch of healing abilities, while Combat Hacker is mostly about dealing with robotic enemies. There are two base abilities for the specialist. The first is Remote Hack. This allows you to interact with certain objectives and items without needing to be right next to them. This saves you having to both waste an action to get in range, and also expose yourself in the process. This is actually incredibly important, because reaching these objectives in time without a specialist is usually very difficult. As everyone who's played XCOM 2 knows, the mission timers are incredibly strict. So if you have to stop for anything, you probably won't be able to reach the objective in time. Having the ability to do this quickly and safely is extremely useful. There are also a couple things worth mentioning. First, you need a clear line of sight in order to hack objects, which means you can easily be blocked by lampposts, trees, etc. The other thing is that hacking objectives will always break concealment, so trying to sneak up to an objective usually isn't worth it. The other base ability is Aid Protocol. This is an active ability that grants plus 20 defense to any unit in your squad, including the specialist, with a one-turn cooldown. This is not a turn-ending action, so you can use it and still take a shot, or any other action. It's a pretty substantial defense bonus, being able to effectively make half cover into full cover, or give a soldier half cover if they don't have any. It also doesn't have any limits on range or line of sight. You can use it on any friendly unit on the map as long as they're active. The only thing to bear in mind is that the AI will always prioritize the best shot. Which means that if there are two soldiers in half cover, and you give Aid Protocol to one of them, you're guaranteeing the other one will be shot at. Otherwise, this is just a nice defensive ability that, because of its short cooldown, you can throw out at pretty much any time. This combines really well with Sparks, who only have 15 defense normally, allowing you to bring them almost in line with full cover.
Down here.
The first two abilities at Corporal are Medical Protocol and Combat Protocol. Medical Protocol is arguably the foundation for medics in XCOM 2. It's an ability which replaces regular healing and stabilizing, allowing you to use the gremlin to do it instead. It also gives you an extra medikit without having to pack one. This is a great upgrade, in that you no longer have to waste an action moving to the injured soldier in order to heal them. In addition, it's not a turn-ending action, so you can heal someone and also still take a shot. The fact it also comes with a medikit means you don't have to worry about giving up a grenade, or some other piece of equipment, in order to bring an emergency heal. It's a very strong pick, which makes choosing between these two abilities very difficult. Combat Protocol is an active ability where you send a gremlin to zap a target. For basic gremlins, this deals a guaranteed 2 damage, which ignores armor, and you get 2 charges for each mission. Against robotic enemies, this increases to 4 to 5 damage, and both the base damage and bonus increase as you tech up. Even on missions without robotic enemies, this is a useful ability because it acts as an upgraded stock. An important note is that for all of the combat hacker abilities, the bonus damage only applies to purely robotic enemies such as turrets and mechs. This is different to blue screen rounds, which are strong against a larger amount of enemies. It's also worth noting that Combat Protocol behaves like squad sight for sharpshooters. If anyone in your squad can see a target, and the specialist has a clear line of sight between them, they can still use Combat Protocol even if they can't directly see the target. This is a difficult choice because both abilities are very useful. Ultimately, I usually end up going for Combat Protocol, to kill enemies before they become a problem. But there have been several times where I really wish I had Medical Protocol instead. For Sergeant, you get Revival Protocol and Haywire Protocol. Revival Protocol is an active ability where, once per mission, you can remove a negative status effect, up to and including unconsciousness. It's also not a turn-ending action. This ability is particularly useful against enemies such as Stun Lancers and the Chosen, whose main attacks regularly inflict mental status effects. On its own it can't revive someone from a bleeding out state, but if you stabilize them first, then you can use Revival Protocol to get them back in the fight. Another interesting use for this ability is a faction mission type where you have to rescue a VIP and their escort from the Lost. The escort is normally unconscious, and you have to carry them out. With Revival Protocol, you can restore them, freeing you from having to carry them and also allowing them to contribute to the fight. While it's not useful in most missions, it's a nice option to have occasionally. Haywire Protocol is an active ability which allows you to attempt to hack robotic enemies. It has a 4-turn cooldown, and you can either disable or take control of them. Disable lasts for 1 turn, and control lasts at least 2 to 3 turns. It's important to note that you will only keep the robot until the end of your turn. Once the alien's turn starts, the robot will instantly reset itself and be able to attack again. This can lead to some nasty situations where you have no time to react to the robot regaining control. Unfortunately, the game often doesn't tell you how long the hack will last. Also, the chances to take control for most soldiers are usually so low that it's not worth trying. The penalty for failing the hack isn't too severe, just +10 aim and defense for the robot, but it's usually much safer to just shut it down rather than trying for a hack. That being said, the ability to take a robotic enemy out of the fight for a turn is quite useful in some cases, since they're usually some of the tougher enemies. At Lieutenant rank, there is Field Medic and Scanning Protocol. Field Medic is a passive that just makes it so that medikits have 3 uses instead of 1. There's nothing particularly special about this ability. It does stack with Medical Protocol, meaning you can both have 4 charges, and also be able to remotely heal or stabilize. Otherwise it's just a fairly solid ability, especially if you want to have more than 1 heal for a mission. Scanning Protocol is an active ability that increases the specialist's sight radius, and reveals hidden enemies in range. By default it only has 1 charge, but tier 3 gremlins will get 2. This ability is neither a turn-ending action, nor does it break concealment, which can allow you to safely check an area before moving. Otherwise its uses are mainly limited to some of the hidden enemies in the game, such as Faceless. The one exception to this is the Assassin, since you can use this to reveal her before she can attack. That being said, you can also do the same thing with battle scanners or just good scouting. It's a pretty situational ability, unfortunately. At rank 4, Captain, you have Covering Fire and Threat Assessment. Covering Fire is a passive ability that upgrades your Overwatch to also trigger on most enemy attacks. The main problem with this ability is the same as the Sharpshooter's Return Fire. A lot of the enemies that trigger this will be in cover, which means that not only are you suffering the Overwatch penalties, you're also having to deal with the cover bonus as well. Not to mention that the only time you'll benefit from this ability is if you're overwatching in combat, which is usually a worse option than just taking a standard shot. Especially for the enemies that don't take cover. Finally, enemies often move as their first action, meaning you would have triggered it with a standard Overwatch anyway. Honestly, I'm not really sure what the point of this ability is meant to be. Threat Assessment, on the other hand, is a passive that upgrades your aid protocol to also give a Covering Fire reaction shot. It's also one of the only abilities in the game that has a downside, that being that it increases aid protocol's cooldown by 1 turn. To reiterate, this is a Covering Fire reaction shot. So you can still get the benefits of Covering Fire even if you take the other ability. You can use it on yourself or any other member of your squad. Also, because Aid Protocol isn't a turn-ending action, you can now both shoot and Overwatch on the same turn. Pretty much the only reason not to take this ability is the cooldown increase. If you're using Aid Protocol to continuously buff a unit's defense, like a Spark, this ability makes it harder, although you do get the benefit of a free Overwatch shot. This is pretty much a non-choice, at least for me. For Major, there is Ever Vigilant and Guardian. Ever Vigilant is a passive ability that gives a free Overwatch if you spend all of your actions moving. There are some rare cases where this can be useful, but for the most part it offers very little. When it says moves, it's very specific. If you do anything else with the specialist during your turn, you won't get the Overwatch. This makes its uses very limited because you have to give up doing anything else in order to proc it. It's not quite as pointless to me as Covering Fire, but it's not far off. Guardian, on the other hand, can be a spectacular ability sometimes. It's a passive that upgrades your Overwatch to have a 50% chance to trigger an additional Overwatch if your shot hits. There's no limit on the number of times this can happen, so if you're incredibly lucky you could proc it 3, or even more times. This is the main reason why I recommended an expanded magazine and scope for attachments. This works on all forms of Overwatch, which means it benefits from several of the other abilities. In particular, Threat Assessment becomes even more powerful, as now not only can you shoot an Overwatch, you may potentially get several Overwatch shots. I almost always take this ability. When it procs, it can do some pretty serious damage. And finally, at Colonel, we have Restoration and Capacitor Discharge. Restoration is an active ability that's most often described as a panic button. The gremlin flies to each squad member, healing or reviving them as needed. It has 1 charge per mission, and unlike the other healing abilities, it does end the turn. There's nothing particularly special to say about Restoration. It's simply a way to combine multiple heals or revives into one action, allowing you to get back into the fight quicker in an emergency. The only minor note is that it doesn't require medikits, or either medical or revival protocols. This means if you really wanted to, you could bring 5+ heals into a mission with all of the healing abilities. The only real downside it has going for it, is that generally you're planning to avoid the situations where it's most useful. Capacitor Discharge is an active ability that sends the gremlin to do a large area of effect attack. This has a chance to disorient or stun enemies, it has a small damage bonus for robotic targets, and it has 1 charge per mission.
Full charge!
With a tier 3 gremlin, this does 7 to 10 damage against regular enemies, which is pretty significant. It also has a 7-tile circular target area, which is the same size as an advanced grenade launcher's blast radius. Unlike Combat Protocol, this doesn't have any armor piercing whatsoever, meaning you generally don't want to use it as an opener. It also doesn't function like Squad Sight, your specialist needs to be able to see the target to use it there. Finally, the bonus damage for robotic enemies is a little under 50% on average. It basically functions as a large grenade, that doesn't shred or destroy cover, but does a little bit of extra damage to robotic targets. Having a specialist be able to throw this out occasionally is pretty great. For specialists, I typically choose Combat Protocol, Haywire Protocol, Field Medic, Threat Assessment, Guardian, and Capacitor Discharge. I would strongly consider doubling back for Medical Protocol, and possibly switching Haywire for Revival Protocol. This build is a mix of combat and utility. You have medical and hacking for support, and plenty of offensive tools for fights.